In winning the 2022 World Cup, Lionel Messi has cemented his status in many people's minds as the greatest footballer of all time. It has long been debated whether someone can truly be considered an all-time great without winning what is widely considered to be the biggest trophy in their sport. The answer to me is clear: of course they can. If Messi had been born in Albania rather than Argentina, or Pelé in Bolivia instead of Brazil, they would never have won the World Cup. Would that make them any less good at football? Obviously not, yet greatness is intangible, difficult to define, and even harder to measure, and big moments at the World Cup, by virtue of it being the biggest tournament in football, are integral to the legacies of so many great players. With that in mind, I wanted to take a quick look at some of the greatest players who never won the World Cup, starting with who I consider to be the 7 greatest, followed by a number of honourable mentions that many of you will be fuming with me for leaving out, but that is all part of the fun. I will try to explain my logic throughout, though obviously these things are highly subjective, but without any further ado, here are the 7 greatest footballers, in my eyes at least, who never won the FIFA World Cup. 7th, Zico. We start with a man who I would consider, certainly outside of Brazil, Italy and Japan, to be one of the most underrated footballers of all time. Nicknamed the White Pelé, Zico broke into the Brazil team 5 years after Pelé retired from international football, and had he been able to replicate Pelé's success at the World Cup, he would most likely have a similar status and legacy within the game. Heading into the 1986 World Cup in Mexico, there was a great deal of debate about who was the best player on the planet between Zico, Maradona and Platini, all 3 of them number 10s, and I have long felt that, whilst I do think Maradona was the best of the 3 at his peak, which also was at that World Cup, had either France or Brazil won that World Cup instead of Argentina, either Zico or Platini would probably be spoken about in the same terms as Maradona over 30 years on. Unlike Pelé, Zico wasn't a teenage sensation, struggling even to earn a professional contract in his early years, and then to break into Flamengo's first team due to his lack of strength and slim physique. It was only when Flamengo's youth team coach, who had already worked with Zico, was handed the first team job that Zico got his big break, and he was 23 years old when he won his first cap for Brazil. From that point on though, there was no looking back. One of the finest dribblers of all time, Zico was for many years the best playmaker and the best goal-scoring midfielder in all of world football. He was integral during a golden age for Flamengo, scoring a quite incredible 65 goals in his most prolific season from midfield, before becoming the best player in Serie A at Udinese, even in his 30s, and later revolutionising football in Japan. So much so that there is still a statue of him outside of the home ground of his former club Kashima Antlers. Zico had 3 cracks at the World Cup in 1978, 1982 and 1986, as Brazil finished 3rd in 1978 and 5th in both 1982 and 1986. If Zico had won any of those World Cups, he'd probably be remembered as one of the 10 greatest players of all time. He didn't, of course, so he isn't. But he makes my 7 greatest that didn't, which I'm sure will come as an enormous comfort to him. 6th, Lev Yashin. The title of this video is The 7 Greatest Footballers Who Never Won the World Cup, and there is an argument to be had that goalkeepers aren't even footballers. I mean, they are, of course, officially speaking, but they also sort of aren't, are they? It is hard enough comparing forwards and defenders, let alone someone whose role is so far removed from any outfield player that they might as well be playing another sport. Nonetheless, given that they do exist, and they play in probably the most important position on the pitch, they cannot be overlooked. And Lev Yashin is still, rightly in my view, considered to be the greatest goalkeeper of all time. Born in Moscow, Yashin was Dynamo Moscow's number 1 for 20 years, and the Soviet Union's for 16. For more than a decade, he was almost universally regarded as being the best goalkeeper on the planet, and the finest that the game had ever witnessed. Not an absolute giant of a man, at 6'2", Yashin's presence and broad shoulders added an extra foot in the eyes of forwards bearing down on his goal. Renowned not just for his athleticism, reflexes, handling, and all-round goalkeeping fundamentals, but also for the way in which he influenced the game, every keeper that followed Yashin for the next 3 decades sought to emulate aspects of his game. In terms of charging out to meet onrushing attackers, communicating with his defenders, and becoming an active participant in the game, not just when called into action by a shot on his goal, Yashin was, rather fittingly, a footballing revolutionary from the USSR. Still the only goalkeeper to have won the Ballon d'Or, like Zico, Yashin competed in 3 World Cups, in 1958, 1962, and 1966. The USSR reached the quarter-finals in 58 and 62, and the semis in 66, where they lost 2-1 to the West Germans. As the greatest player of all time in his position, whilst it is so difficult to compare it with any other position, I do still think that Yashin is good value for a spot in 6th. 5th, Michel Platini. I mentioned Michel Platini not that long ago in the context of Zico and Maradona, and despite being a truly wretched human being, like a number of great athletes I suppose, there can be no doubting his talents or greatness within the sport. The greatest Frenchman ever to have played the game, and one of the 5 finest Europeans, it is only through a combination of World Cup success and recency bias that anyone would be led to conclude that Zinedine Zidane was a greater player than him. Zizou was more elegant, not just than Platini, but than almost anyone who has ever played the game, a better athlete, and perhaps a little better in transition. But Platini was better at everything else, including passing the ball and scoring goals, and in terms of the latter, it wasn't even close. Platini scored 312 goals in 580 games at club level, and 41 goals from 72 caps for France, whilst playing in midfield. And at his most prolific, he was averaging almost a goal a game. Platini won the Euros with France in 1984, where he scored 9 goals in 5 games, but they were knocked out by West Germany in the semi-finals of both the 1982 and 1986 World Cups. Platini made the team of the tournament at both of those World Cups, but a year after Mexico in '86, he retired from football, voluntarily, aged only 31. It was a short but remarkable career, in which Platini won 3 successive Ballon d'Ors during his glory days at Juventus, and he won everything that is worth winning within the sport, other than the FIFA World Cup. 4th, Ferenc Puskas. It is easy to fall into the trap of running out of superlatives in these types of videos, and it is really difficult to put into words the majesty and greatness of the most magical of Hungary's magical Magyars, namely Ferenc Puskas. The most concise way of summing up quite how spectacular he was is to note that in 1956, following the Hungarian Revolution in which he and several other of Hungary's star players left the country, he was banned for 2 years by UEFA for refusing to return to Hungary and to his club Budapest Honvéd, then aged 29. A 2-year ban for a lot of footballers at the age of 29, particularly in the days before most of the sports science and nutritional breakthroughs that modern players benefit from came in, would have been career-ending. Not for Ferenc Puskas though, a man to whom football was second nature. After his 2-year ban came to an end, age 31, he signed for Real Madrid, and over the next 8 years, so between the ages of 31 and 39, he scored 242 goals in 262 games for the best team in Europe. It is remarkable to think what Puskas could have achieved with those extra 2 years, which likely would have been his best, or even just if his legacy at Budapest Honvéd, where he had an even better goal-scoring record, was as appreciated as his time at Real Madrid. Sadly, a combination of war, exile and injuries meant that Puskas only ever competed in 1 World Cup, in 1954, which Hungary went into as the best national team on the planet and as enormous favourites. Puskas scored 3 goals in Hungary's opening 2 games, but in the second of those games, he suffered a hairline fracture to his ankle, thought to rule him out for their remaining fixtures. He was rushed back for the final despite the injury, against West Germany, in which he scored after just 6 minutes but clearly was not fully fit, and Hungary went on to lose the game 3-2. Third, Johan Cruyff. You can count on one hand the number of people who have ever been better at football than Johan Cruyff, and there may be none who have ever found the sport so easy or so effortless. Remembered today primarily as a pioneer of total football, at Ajax, Barcelona and with the Netherlands, in his early years, before he had such great influence, Cruyff was just an utter goal-scoring and creating phenomenon who tormented defences without needing to break a sweat. At the age of 18, he scored 25 goals in 23 games for Ajax, and the following season, he struck 41 times in 41 games. Cruyff dropped deeper and deeper as his career went on, still scoring a ludicrous number of goals, but also running matches, orchestrating those around him, and becoming, quite literally, the total footballer. It is a tragedy that Cruyff then only ever played at one World Cup, in 1974, in which the Netherlands cruised to the final and Cruyff was the tournament's outstanding player. In the final, before West Germany had even touched the ball, Cruyff won a penalty in the opening minute. It was dispatched, but West Germany fought back to win the game 2-1. The Netherlands reached the final again in 1978, where they lost to the hosts Argentina, but Cruyff stayed at home, fearing for his family's safety following a kidnapping attempt in Barcelona. In terms of greatness, there is little to split the top 3 in this 7, and I wouldn't argue with anyone who considered Cruyff to be the greatest of the lot. Second, Cristiano Ronaldo. The only active player in this 7, I know that there is some talk on social media of Cristiano Ronaldo sticking it out until the 2026 World Cup, but given the fact that he will be 41 years old by then, is most likely just about to go to Saudi Arabia, and his regression already over the last 12 to 18 months, you'll have to forgive me for not being convinced. And his tears, when Portugal were knocked out by Morocco in the quarterfinals in Qatar, would suggest to me that neither is he. The 2022 World Cup couldn't have gone much worse for Ronaldo, who was dropped mid-tournament just as he has been at club level this season, and forced to watch on as a man who he has so long viewed as his rival got his hands on his first World Cup. But his fall from grace over the last 12 to 18 months, or not blind us, to what Ronaldo has achieved within the game. From tricky winger to complete wide forward, and eventually a dead-eyed poacher, Ronaldo is one of the deadliest goal scorers ever to have played the game. His record at Real Madrid, where he scored 450 goals in 438 games, was his most impressive. Meanwhile, 118 goals from 196 games for Portugal makes him the highest scoring player in the history of men's international football and the joint highest appearance holder. The 2022 World Cup was Ronaldo's 5th and almost certainly his last. The closest he came to glory was at his first, in 2006, when Portugal beat England on penalties in the quarter-finals, but lost 1-0 to France in the semis. I think Johan Cruyff, Ferenc Puskas, Michel Platini and Zico were all more naturally gifted players than Ronaldo, and it is testament to his mentality, longevity and work ethic that, for all of his faults, he has arguably still gone on to have a greater career than all of them. Honourable mentions. I could go on for days in terms of the litany of honourable mentions for a 7 such as this, but that would be deeply tedious, so I won't. Instead, I will limit myself to only an extra 7, so a second 7 if you like. Jose Manuel Moreno was considered the greatest Argentinian footballer of all time by almost all those who saw him, including those who also saw Alfredo Di Stefano, Maradona, and even Messi, if they lived for quite a long time, but he never got the chance to compete in a World Cup, let alone win one, since Argentina didn't participate in 1938, and World War II meant that there wasn't another World Cup until 1950. Paolo Maldini is undoubtedly one of the greatest defenders ever to have laced up a pair of boots, and whilst he was still active, and indeed still world class when Italy won the World Cup in 2006, he had retired from international football following the disappointment of the 2002 World Cup, having come closest in 1994 when Italy lost on penalties in the final against Brazil. Arguably Britain's two greatest footballers, John Charles and George Best, only competed in one World Cup between them when Charles was part of a Wales team that gave Brazil their toughest test at the 1958 World Cup. Staying local, still some might suggest, the greatest player that England has ever produced, Stanley Matthews, was 35 years old at his first World Cup and 39 at his second, and England won neither of them. Europe's greatest pre-war footballer, Matthias Schindler, was Austria's star man at the 1934 World Cup, but refused to represent Germany following the Anschluss at the World Cup in 1938, and Eusebio, Golden Boot winner in 66 but a losing semi-finalist nonetheless, completes my honourable 7. And that brings us to top spot. First, Alfredo Di Stefano. I am of the opinion that Lionel Messi and Pelé are the two greatest footballers of all time, and after that, there are 4 players, I think, who could lay claim to bronze. The least frequently mentioned of those 4, largely by virtue of when he played, is Alfredo Di Stefano, but no discussion around the greatest footballers of all time could be complete without him. Completeness, incidentally, is something that Di Stefano has over all of his rivals for that crown, as the most complete player ever to have played the game. Originally a forward in the late days of River Plate's great La Maquina team, Di Stefano headed to Colombia's Bandit League as Argentinian footballers went on strike, before Real Madrid managed to wrestle him out of the clutches of Barcelona in a transfer battle that would come to define the next half-century of both Spanish and European football. Over the years, whilst Di Stefano continued to score goals as though he were still an out-and-out centre-forward, he had actually begun to drop increasingly deep, sometimes even into his own half, picking the ball up off of his centre-half and initiating attacks. Flawless in possession, laser-like in the pass, and lethal in front of goal, it's often said that Di Stefano turned Real Madrid from being the second best team in Madrid to the finest in all of Europe. And whilst, of course, he didn't do that alone, no one was more important to that transformation than him. Los Blancos' talisman, as they won 5 consecutive European Cups, Di Stefano himself won a couple of Ballon d'Ors, and everything that there was to win within the club game, time and time again. International football was rather less kind to him though, despite the fact that he represented 2 different national teams, or 3 if one counts the outlawed Colombia representative 11. Di Stefano scored 6 goals in 6 games for Argentina, all coming in 1947 at the age of 21, but it would be a decade before he officially played international football again, this time for Spain, following 4 years at Real Madrid. Spain failed to qualify for the 1958 World Cup, and after qualifying in 1962, by which stage Di Stefano was 35 but still a key man, injury prevented him from playing at the tournament as Spain went out in the group stage. Alfredo Di Stefano then, the greatest of greats that this sport has ever seen, not only never won the World Cup, he never even played a World Cup game. That is it for today's video, but thank you all very much as ever for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it, I sincerely hope that was the case of course. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and feel free to subscribe and turn on notifications for HITC Sevens. You can also find me on either Twitter or on Instagram by the username @HITC Sevens on both, should you wish to do so.